You can't put your vape out on someone's arm in prison.
Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast and happy Labor Day Monday. My name is Jody Avirgan. Today, an end of summer edition of the podcast where we are going to pull out a handy tool that we like to use from time to time. It's an article that Nate wrote back in February 2017 describing the 14 different possible versions of the Trump presidency from making America great again to impeachment. We're going to discuss which of those paths seem most likely or least likely, and maybe more interestingly, what has changed since the last time we gathered around a table and did this. Here, gathered around that table, our editor-in-chief, Nate Silver. Hello, Nate.
Hi, Jody.
We're all wearing white jeans.
Oh, because of Labor Day. Just to get it in on our last possible day. The clock is ticking. That's true.
And isn't it nice of us to all come in on Labor Day?
Oh, man. How was your Sunday?
It was wonderful.
What'd you do?
I went to the beach.
Yeah?
My friend has a house in Avalon, and he was kind enough to invite me down.
You know, I went to the U.S. Open, and boy, let me tell you, some of the matches that I saw, there were some favorites that won.
What was the most surprising result?
Probably that thing that Serena did.
Yeah, that was amazing.
I'm going to get through the intros here. Claire Malone, politics writer, hello.
Sup?
And managing editor Micah Cohen, hello.
Hello.
And I guess we should disclose that we are, in fact, taping this before Labor Day. Listeners, be kind if a lot of stuff has happened in the intervening 3 days.
What could happen?
When you're listening, what could possibly happen?
What could happen?
But you know what? We need our vacation.
No, I can prove we taped this. So Donald Trump tweeted something crazy. That happened yesterday, right? Am I right?
Yes, you're probably right.
Yesterday morning.
Okay, let's get into it. And actually, before we talk about the 14 paths, we should say that tomorrow, Tuesday, when you're listening to this, listeners, that is the beginning of the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. So let's talk a little bit about that. Claire, what's the expectation at this point? I mean, is it likely that Kavanaugh will be confirmed? And the beginning of the term is October 1st. So by then...
First Supreme Court justice named Brett, which is a big day for America.
That wasn't the question.
How big of a day is this for America?
That is my way of saying that, yes, I believe that Kavanaugh will be confirmed. We are talking on Wednesday before Labor Day. So we've seen, most notably at this point, Senator Susan Collins saying a few days ago, I feel comfortable where Kavanaugh is on Roe v. Wade being settled law. She was sort of seen as this notable swing vote who had been vocal about being worried about what he would do to overturn Roe.
Worried, yeah.
But I think like it's to me it's a little bit of a, it's not a formality because he is unpopular, but I do think odds on he will be confirmed.
What's that term for when you're going through the motions?
Kabuki.
Life?
Yeah, it's kabuki.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like even Collins saying, "Oh, I'm worried," or what was it? Rand Paul floated his usual, "Oh, I may not vote for him," and then he came around. So it does kind of feel like pro forma, even in the complications. But Mike, is there anything that could actually derail this or make it more complicated as the hearings get started?
Two things. So I do think it is kabuki. I mean, you know, Collins, Murkowski, for example, have these deep concerns about abortion. They meet with Kavanaugh. He assures them that he respects precedent and that it's settled law, and they're reassured. What do you think he's going to say? You know, this is like long-standing Supreme Court nominee practice.
Steve Bannon coached him to say, "I'm going to burn it all down."
Yeah, like what he's going. Anyway, so there's that. How could it go wrong? I think it would take a pretty big revelation, maybe coming out of his previous writings or testimony when he's testifying during his confirmation hearings. He would have to screw up in a big way. I mean, something related to abortion or, you know, maybe holding the president accountable. You know, if he sits up there and says a president is above the law, I think he'd be in some trouble.
Nate, one thing that is slightly different from previous kind of paths that we've walked in terms of people getting confirmed, our colleague Nathaniel Rakich wrote about this, but Kavanaugh's confirmation was at net 5 approval, and overall his approval is kind of more on par with nominees who haven't gotten confirmed than nominees who have. Is that at all something to read into?
I mean, a Supreme Court justice is a big thing, right? And so the GOP is going to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the fact that
first by the way of the podcast,
BTW, by the way,
BTW, that's confirmation with a K for Kavanaugh.
By the way, the fact that you're going to have a replacement for John McCain, who passed away in Arizona, will probably help the cause too. Now they aren't missing a vote, so I think they were hoping that we will confirm him and will be really popular with our base, right? I think now they're going to confirm him, and the political fallout will be neutral, or maybe even a little negative, right? But neutral negative you would take for one of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court. All the Republicans who might have voted against a shortlist to begin with, right? But Susan Collins sounds inclined to vote for. Rand Paul sounds inclined to vote for. Lisa Murkowski can vote against now, and it doesn't matter because, we're going to have a new Republican who's presumably maybe not necessarily conservative, but I'm sure on the Kavanaugh issue will vote to confirm. So there's not much suspense barring new revelations in these hearings. It is true that, the hearings usually make you less popular maybe, and so, but still the GOP has done things that are considerably more unpopular than this in the past, as Democrats have at times, and I think the writing is on the wall.
So that would be my question is Kavanaugh is already unpopular, as Jody said, for a Supreme Court nominee. Let's say he has a bad hearing and becomes more unpopular. I think Nate is right that because the prize is so valuable here, a seat on the Supreme Court, Republicans will do it anyway, and it would take something truly massive to derail it. But what do you guys think if he just, let's say he has a universally agreed upon poor showing in the confirmation hearings, but nothing massive comes out, could that derail it?
I think when Collins seemed more undecided and Rand Paul and the Arizona seat was effectively vacant, then I think it was less margin for error. Now I think they have a medium-sized margin for error. Not as much as they would have had with Gorsuch, where they start out from a much higher threshold, right? But I think there would have to be several minor foul-ups or one big foul-up. I think they could survive 1 or 2 nicks.
But Micah, let's spin your question forward then, though. Let's say he has a rocky confirmation hearing, but Republicans push him through. Does that have any impact on the midterms, or is it once these confirmation hearings are over, we move on? And
that's a good question. I don't know is the short answer. I would imagine that, on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of rocky confirmation hearings, I don't think Kavanaugh getting on the court changes the midterm calculus.
Also,
much.
Democrats aren't as motivated by Supreme Court appointments as Republicans are historically.
Yeah, although I am sort of on the lookout for evidence that maybe that's changing.
I mean, there's sort of the dark argument of what happens with Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah.
If Trump wins another term, if you're speaking as a Democrat, if we keep this Republican Congress, then Trump is going to be given free rein as seats open up over the next 2 to 6 years.
There is a fair amount of Merrick Garland bitterness still out there for the Democratic base that this could potentially rile up. Is that a factor?
I think that yes and no. I think there's a section of the Democratic base that is still angry about Garland never getting a vote, but that segment of the base is the base and is riled up and is going to turn out anyway. And as we saw in 2016, I don't think there was a lot of evidence that swing voters or more marginal Democratic voters rallied around Merrick Garland being denied a seat and flocked to the polls. So I'm speculating, but I don't think anything similar would happen this year.
Yeah, I think this is like the 33rd most important issue from a horse. Maybe not 33rd, but the 8th most important issue from a horse race standpoint.
To voters.
Yeah, it might be the first most important issue from a substantive standpoint.
In life, yeah.
But from a voter issue, the fact is this guy's not that popular. He's also not so unpopular that Democrats who already have lots of reasons to turn out would necessarily have extra reasons to turn out. I mean, in the abstract, it's more important to the Senate because the Senate is the branch that confirms members of the Supreme Court. But I don't think this is going to be something that people are spending a lot of time talking about in November. And if you make the claim, the Republican base turned out because of Kavanaugh, maybe, but I think that is a claim that has to be made with evidence.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on, and we're going to talk about Trump's 14 paths and reassess and revisit those. But first, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by WeWork. Whether you are a team of 2 or 200 at WeWork, space matters. From single desk solutions and innovative amenities to flexible private offices designed to grow along with your headcount, WeWork gives your business the space you need to connect, focus, build, and succeed. WeWork now has over 280 locations across more than 70 cities in 24 countries around the world, making it the perfect partner for your next satellite office, regional headquarters, or remote employees. Your team members spend over a third of their lives in your office space, so why not make it exceptional? Everything from IT and maintenance to security, cleaning, wellness, programming, and cold brew on tap is handled by WeWork. They'll handle all of those things, but again, cold brew on tap, by far the most important thing when you want a productive workspace. WeWork provides the intentional design, infectious energy, and outstanding service your team needs in order to just show up and do what you do best. Visit WeWork.com to find a location near you today. All right, we're back, and it has been a while since we've done this to step back and assess which path we feel like the Trump presidency is on, and we're going to use this article that Nate wrote right after the Trump inauguration, where he laid out 14 different versions of the presidency. I will not go through all 14 versions, but I will say that we've stopped and taken stock at a number of different points. And since the last time we did this, a number of things have changed. There's been obviously the ongoing legal problems, Cohen and Manafort in particular, the Helsinki conference, but also a record-breaking stock market, good job numbers, and some trade deals with Europe and Mexico. So I'm curious to see where we stand as a group. Nate, do you want to just start maybe by, if you got a chance to look back at your article, kind of laying out those groups that you looked at, and also where your head's at right now in terms of the different paths?
I think that if you just weighted all 14 about equally, that wouldn't actually be a bad algorithm for how the presidency's unfolded. You know, when I've looked at this in the past, it's like, with maybe there's some exceptions. I think some of the scandal routes, obviously, you'd put a little bit more weight on. But it's surprising to me how partially true almost all of these are, and but none of them exactly completely describes
all
the situation.
Of them? I think some of them are out there.
Some of them are not.
So why don't we
not
start
on
there?
board.
The ones that we feel like are no longer on the board.
I don't think number 14, Trump's button mashing works because the system is really broken, is actually true. Nate will say that it's the economy stupid and that the economy is doing well. But on a lot of other things, I'm not sure you can, like, what else can you point to besides the economy, which arguably Trump had nothing to do with?
Arguably, I don't know about that necessarily. You saw a big boost in consumer confidence among voters when Trump was elected. Greased the wheels for entrepreneurship. I mean, you're right that there's a lot of if Ben Kesselman were still here, he would be scolding me for, But this is just saying that, like, look, okay, I think you can argue that on North Korea, that this kind of let's try something different strategy by comparison seems to be working okay, because even though there are lots of problems with what North Korea is actually doing, the alternatives seem to be equally bad, right? Micah is giving me a look that I've never seen from him before.
They're okay. Inherent in button mashing is that Trump is taking active steps. The economy, let's say Trump mashed the button there and it worked. Let's give him credit for that, even though, as you say, there's all sorts of research and scholarly work that shows presidents actually have little effect on the economy. North Korea, he mashed the button there. That doesn't seem to be bearing any fruit, correct?
Really? I'd rather...
they just called off the follow-up meeting, right?
I'd rather have this kabuki thing where they're being nice to each other than actually threatening to nuke one another. How's that?
They also did threaten to nuke one another, too.
Healthcare,
the button didn't work.
Well, it worked with
Trade,
the Republican who wants to undermine Obamacare.
Trade, it doesn't seem to be working.
Really? I would think that a lot of liberals would have predicted...
we could do this all show.
I would think a lot of liberals would have
can Nate be?
predicted far worse fallout from the tariffs than what you've seen.
That's not the same as working.
Biased.
All right, let me
come back to you though on this one before we move on to some other ones and see if the point of this path is that Trump comes in and really shakes up the status quo and kind of rattles the cages of Washington elite. Can we say that 18 months in that has happened to some effect?
To me, the spirit of this path is that because the system was so broken, any approach that just differed from the status quo would have a lot of benefits. And I don't think there's evidence, maybe you could argue for a couple sort of isolated cases, that that's true.
Or even to go back to Nate's, like, something from every single one of these paths has happened. What about number 13, Trump pivoting to the center? Like, which things do you think that is?
Doesn't that kind of play that he gets his ass kicked at the midterm elections and then pivots? Or is that...
Oh, I see. So 13, as you phrased it back in 2017, was Trump becomes Governor Schwarzenegger. But that implies that he pivots to the center and stabilizes and builds consensus and all
So
of
if they're
those
doing
things.
a good job of getting their ass kicked at the midterms, then maybe Path 13
wait a
is looking
second.
more...
Do you think that's still on the table?
Yeah, no, that something could still happen. Anything could still happen. I don't think we should talk about what do we have evidence is actually happening.
Right. Like, are we describing what our current state is or what could come down?
I think we want to describe what our current state is and what seems likely, not what's possible in any alternate.
I do respect Nate's attempted defense of all parts of his piece. It's like, I can stand for that.
Democrats win 42 seats in the House, and somehow Beto wins his race.
Are you really going to say it that way from now through November?
Isn't that how he said
Keep
it?
going.
Somehow O'Rourke wins his race,
Yeah.
and they take the Senate, right? You think Trump's not going to be like, screw Republicans, I'm going to be Mr. Bipartisan, right?
I don't think
I
Trump
don't know.
would be that. I think all evidence points to him not being that way.
Well, not all evidence, but
I mean-
I think it's like a close enough thing where it's like he might just be, screw it.
He might be screwed. He's not tipping his hand that he'll go that way. He's talking about a red wave and all that stuff. I just think the conversation of like what is possible is too I think we should talk about what path are we on now.
so throw some out there.
Trump becomes Schwarzenegger. There's no evidence that's happening.
Okay.
Let me throw some other ones out there.
And we should say Micah printed this out and is really lording it over us that he has a paper
I'm
copy.
looking at the.
He's he's a managing editor. He's living his best life. His best, most organized life.
I started spinning, as Claire said. Trump plunges America into outright authoritarianism. I don't think that's happening. There's a Trump mellows out one. Where's that one?
Number 4.
Yeah, Trump mellows out slightly.
Defend that one, Nate.
This is the mildest course change. In this case, after an up and down first 3 to 6 months, Trump gradually gets better at the job of being president, not necessarily because of concerted effort to pivot, but because he learns through trial and error and he needs to pick his battles.
Has
not
Trump
happening.
learned to pick his battles?
Okay,
But like that looked a little better like earlier this year. Is the
but we're talking
chill.
about what's happening.
We're not giving
Nate,
you shit for writing this article.
You got to
in
be willing to kill
2017.
some of your
Steve
babies.
Bannon and other more incendiary advisors lose stature. That part's true.
That part's true.
That part's
Is
true.
that when you're writing, Nate? Is that the voice you hear in your head? Because that would explain a
All
lot.
right,
Actually,
Micah, keep going through some of the ones that are.
Okay, Trump successfully pivots to the populist center, but with plenty of authoritarianism too. Nope.
Why not? Why
all
not?
the policy coming out of Congress and out of the administration is
corporate
standard.
Republican.
Yeah, I mean, look at the environmental stuff. Like, look at the tax stuff. That's standard corporate Republican. So that's not happening. I think the rest you could argue. Well, Trump keeps rewriting the political rules and gradually becomes more popular. There's not really evidence of that yet.
Should we talk
He's
about
a
the
little,
one?
well, no, hold on. He's more popular than he was a year ago. He's gone from 38 to 41.
What's that? The endpoint fallacy when you pick a random endpoint?
No, but it's not trivial, right? I mean, because approval rating is one of the more tangible indicators, and it's not. Well, maybe it is falling over the past month or so. You can debate that, right? But like, it's meaningful that like he didn't stick at 38, 39, or didn't keep falling.
I agree. I think that's meaningful, but there's no evidence that he's on an upward trajectory.
There is relative to 9 months ago or a year ago.
Has he rewritten the political rules in the way
No,
that
40,
this says?
no, this is important, though.
Okay,
Hold on. I'm
go
not
ahead.
going to relent on this point. 41 or 42 is not good, but 41 or 42 is in the normal range of not good, right?
It's normal bad.
It's normal bad. Mm-hmm. It's worse than Obama's at a parallel point in his presidency, but not by that much. So that's not trivial, just because like every point from like 44 to like 35 is like an inflection point where things kind of pile up and get worse, I feel like, and so...
No, I agree with all that. My point is about the trajectory. I mean, if I were to describe Trump's approval rating so far, I think there's like 3 eras, right? And this is oversimplified, but there was Trump's version of a honeymoon period in which he was still net negative, unpopular, but like it wasn't terrible. Then he entered that stretch during healthcare where he was down into the 30s, and then he recovered since then basically to sort of like what seems like an equilibrium for him in the low 40s. But I don't think there's evidence of an upward trajectory.
Claire, do you want to talk about any paths that jumped out to you?
Well, I think we should talk about paths that are like the ones that we are actually closest to.
Yeah.
So I would say that our current reality, without looking down, what might happen in the future, is probably closest to number one, which is Trump keeps on trumping and the country remains evenly divided. He rants on Twitter every morning, picks unnecessary fights. The press regularly predicts his demise. Still, Trump's base is at 40 to 45% of the country, and then they stick with him. Given Republicans' geographic advantages in Congress and the Electoral College, it makes for a competitive 2018 and 2020. I think that's
spot on.
I think that's where we are. I think that the two scenarios that stuck out to me as things that are close to what could happen given certain legal developments over the summer are scenarios 7 and 8. 7 is Trump flails around aimlessly after an unsuccessful attempt to pivot. And mostly I am attracted to this thing because he's sort of losing congressional Republicans. And this is what got me. By early 2019, there are impeachment proceedings against Trump, and several Republicans are considering challenging him for the 2020 nomination. The number 8 is Trump is consumed by scandal, which is pretty self-explanatory.
Let me ask you a question about that scenario 7, which is Trump flails around aimlessly after an unsuccessful attempt to pivot. You saying that that's one that is potentially on the horizon if this midterm goes badly. Would you expect Trump to do that?
It's not necessarily related to the midterms. It's related more to the Mueller scandal, I would say. So I would disown the pivot part of it, but talk a little bit more about. I guess I'm looking at 7 and 8 because they draw into the scandal potential, and more importantly, what the 2020 cycle could potentially look like with Republicans challenging Trump. I think that's more what I'm sort of gaming out.
And do you think that would be Trump's reaction if the scandal increases, but also some challengers come out of the woodwork? Do we see an earnest attempt to pivot towards the center? I guess in any of these scenarios in the future.
I'm not saying Trump would pivot towards the center. Sorry, that was a little misleading. What I'm really talking about is the part where we talk about people challenging him because he becomes a lame duck figure. So it has less to do with a so-called pivot to the center and more to do with somehow Trump is politically impotent and Republicans start to leave him.
And I guess I'm just curious what we think Trump's reaction to a scenario like that would be, putting aside the path.
Anger, I would assume. He hasn't shown any propensity to be a centrist. I think he's a double down kind of guy.
He had one moment where he talked about doing an immigration deal with Democrats, but that lasted 36 hours.
Oh yeah, there was a dinner with Pelosi and Schumer or something. God, that seems like a long time ago.
But how, let's say Democrats, the blue wave does happen. How Trump reacts to me is an open question. I don't think there's particular evidence that he would pivot to the center, but I don't know. As Nate was saying earlier, anything's possible. But to me, it's all right, let me throw a few of these out here. Trump keeps on trumping and the country remains evenly divided. That's number 1, right? Trump gradually or not so gradually enters a death spiral. I think both of those are still sort of you could make an argument for either of those. Trump is consumed by scandal. That one, I think, is clearly true, right? And then resistance to Trump from elsewhere in the government undermines his authority but prompts a constitutional crisis.
The deep state.
The deep state. But those 4, I think, are in some combination, those 4 are the ones that I think we're on.
So it's a fairly negatively weighted set of circumstances from Trump's standpoint.
Yes.
And it's ones that don't assume a high likelihood of a pivot.
Yes.
That's correct.
The best one for Trump in those is Trump keeps on trumping, right?
But the country is still evenly divided.
But okay, so most of those are not good for Trump. That one's the best for Trump, but it's also probably has the best argument for it of those 4, right? Trump consumed by scandal, I'm not sure he's been totally consumed yet.
If the GOP holds the House, that one will sound pretty good, right?
Right. And maybe not coincidentally, of those 4 scenarios, that one's the best for Trump. Maybe Republicans keep the House in it. And Republicans have about a 1 in 4 chance of keeping the House, according to our forecast right now.
Wow, look at you tying
It
it all
all
together.
ties together.
So interestingly enough, of those 4 that you mentioned, we polled our audience, and those were among the top 4. And so we'll look at some of those results, and I want to get your thoughts on sort of what our audience thinks and talk a little bit more about this. But first, let's take a quick break. And let me tell you that this week's podcast is brought to you by Finn. Everyone has mundane tasks they could help completing. Generally, these tasks take time away from the more important things you need to do. Finn is a high-quality, on-demand assistant that handles the administrative aspects of life so you can focus on what matters most. Thousands of busy professionals already rely on Finn to handle tasks like scheduling meetings, booking travel, buying gifts, or more complex jobs like creating a website, planning an event, or performing market research. Can I talk to you about one thing that's particularly time-consuming? I had to make a doctor's appointment last week, a very simple visit, and I was going to a place that had a number of locations. Those locations, though, don't have a shared calendar, so I had to call each one individually to find the one that had a time that worked for me. Feels like the kind of task that would have been great to have someone help with. Well, like the best assistants, Finn knows your preferences, remembers the people you interact with, and integrates your email and calendar. It can make calls, send emails on your behalf, pay bills, remember important dates. If you're someone who doesn't have 40 hours of work for an assistant every week, that's the best part. Finn is always available on demand, and you only pay for what you use. Get on board with Finn. Start taking advantage of the help they can offer. Finn.com/politics. That's Finn.com/politics to try it for free. Today's podcast is also brought to you by WordPress. WordPress powers more than 30% of all websites, from your favorite local coffee shops to the world's biggest companies. Join a global high-traffic network of organizations and entrepreneurs when you build your website and your business your way on WordPress.com. WordPress allows you to carve out your own corner of the web with a new custom domain name, or use one that you already own. So maybe if you have a website that is just numbers, or a website where those numbers have to be spelled out, WordPress will help you get that domain. You can create a site that fits you using templates and customizable themes. There's no design experience needed. You can import and export content to and from your WordPress site. It's your website, it's your home, it's your content. WordPress makes it easy to reach a global market and let customers find you with built-in SEO. Your site is search-friendly and ready for the world, and you can get your website up and running for just $4 a month. The time to grow your business is now. Build your website today and get 15% off any new plan purchase at wordpress.com/politics. That's wordpress.com/politics for 15% off. All right, we're back. Let's look at some of these paths again. And as we've done the last few times, we polled the audience and asked them which of these 14 paths do you think is most likely. I shared the results, but
Non-scientific poll.
It's non-scientific poll, though over 1,000 responses, decent sample size.
That's not how it works, Joe.
Yeah.
You need a representative.
Yeah, I said sample size, not representative sample makeup.
Bad use of polling.
Yes, clearly a bad use of polling here. Nevertheless, I will say the top sort of path that people laid out was the one we've been discussing, number 1, which is Trump keeps on trumping and the country remains divided. And then the second one was path number 8, which is Trump is consumed by scandal. And then there's a big drop off after that. So I think as we kind of honed in on it, feels like those two exist. And I think we got a really interesting email from someone, and Nate kind of said this at the beginning, that obviously you wrote this in 2017. Now, as we've gone, we can kind of identify that there's different parts of different paths that have all come true. And so maybe there's a sort of new amalgam path. But it does feel like some combination of those two is a pretty good descriptor of where we are, where he's both continuing to be Trump, but also consumed by scandal at the same time. And I don't know if those feel like incongruous, but it does feel like what's happening.
So, Nate, if you were to do this again, how many different paths do you have, and how similar would they be, or would you pick from some and recombine? And
I think there are probably 2 dimensions along which you could be more robust, right? One of the different dimensions of scandal, right? This article actually doesn't mention the Russia scandal in particular. It just says, okay, Trump's scandal prone, right?
Right.
The other is a little bit the interplay between Trump and the GOP and the different gradations of that, and potential splits within the GOP. I mean, I do like the word...
No, that makes sense, yeah.
I do like the word consumed by scandal in the sense that, like, it is a preoccupation of the White House, and at some point does it become so dysfunctional. But at the same time, part of the exercise of having all these is like, so let's look at a scenario that hasn't happened yet, but you can't rule out. Number 10, Trump's law and order agenda is bolstered by an international incident or a terrorist attack. Is it that hard to imagine that something more severe than has happened to date? There has been nothing, right? But there hasn't been nothing, but like not very much, right? It's not that hard to imagine a fairly serious attack that elicits an extremely serious response.
That was
right?
the most notable thing, I think, reading this back for me, was actually how, outside of unforced errors that Trump has, and I kind of include in some ways the North Korea stuff in that, this has been a very almost eerily calm environment. Like there haven't been any huge international upsets, right? Like
Puerto Rico is the big exception, I think.
Well, that's not international, but like
no, yeah.
But I mean, like in the sense of there hasn't been a San Bernardino, there hasn't been a Paris attack, there haven't been things like that play to Trump's nativism and Trump's law and order thing in the way that I think we expected more of towards the end of the campaign and in the beginning of his presidency. We talked a lot about that, the idea of, you know, some sort of ISIS attack.
And him sort of using that.
And his reaction.
I mean, there is a scenario which isn't quite represented here, which is that, like, maybe there are two scenarios, that this kind of gradually becomes the new normal. I'm not sure if...
this meaning where we're at now?
Yeah, right. And there's a scenario where Trump, which I do think probably would need to be on here, that Trump is more bark than bite. And that's like kind of the opposite almost of the, oh, Trump, there's some terrorist attack and it's martial law. It's kind of saying Trump creates a lot of distractions, kind of the way he ran his campaign. In the end, the major things he's done are actually pretty similar to what Mitt Romney might have done.
On policy,
yes. Right? You pass a tax bill that's very much like the bill Mitt Romney might have passed. You've tried to pass a health care bill, but failed. Obviously, on foreign relations, it's a little bit different, but even there, Trump is willing to back down quite often, right? There are a lot of threats to make full measures that become half measures, which then become quarter measures and whatever else. And so, you know, the kind of thesis that it all seems like a big reality show, but in terms of day-to-day lives, Trump is actually fairly inactive, I think is underrated.
I wonder if we need a spectrum for Trump's positioning and relationship with his party, a spectrum for scandal, and then like a spectrum for policy and a spectrum for like rhetoric and norms. Mm-hmm. Or maybe those overlap too much.
I mean, there's no scenario here for like Trump is just really ineffectual. Maybe there are some of that. Actually, maybe
but that's why you need the different. Sorry, Claire.
Yeah, I think there's some that have an ineffectuality factored in, the lame duck ones.
This is why it's too simplistic to say, "Oh, Trump has governed like a Mitt Romney," because on policy, normally he really has. But then you're sort of just waving away all he's done to sort of undermine faith in the press.
Well, but also like Mitt Romney wouldn't have made the sort of harrowing rhetoric with allies about trade.
No, even on that's true. Even on policy, particularly trade, Trump has sort of bucked some GOP orthodoxy.
So, taking on I know you just did it off the top of your head, Micah, but your new rubric of norms,
new and improved,
norms, policy. Well, let's take those two. If those two areas, those two lanes, so far, can we say that one of those Trump has made a most lasting impact, changing policy or changing our norms?
Oh, that's a tough question. What do people think? Has Trump had more of a lasting impact on U.S. policy or U.S. norms?
Norms.
I mean,
I think we're entering like a very different... I think we have been in and entered in, during the 2016 cycle, a new paradigm.
Can I...
On both sides.
Paradigm shift.
Well,
paradigm shift.
Because there are three grand narratives...
That's a good thriller name. ...
that in 10 years or 20 years, historians will tell about Trump. And these are, to some degree, mutually exclusive. Right?
Prediction. Oh, mutually exclusive.
Number one is that Trump is a big turning point in American politics. Number two is that Trump is a giant, weird outlier. And number three is that, #actually, Trump is consistent with trends that had been emerging before and seems a lot more normal.
Trends emerging before and
like Palin-esque trends.
Yeah, and continuing after?
Yeah, but it's smooth, right? That
Yeah.
it wouldn't look like an outlier. Literally, I'm literally picturing the data, right? And it wouldn't jump out of a scatter plot, right?
So, listeners, one is like this,
Okay,
one
thanks.
is like
Thanks
this.
for
Works
drawing.
great on the radio.
and one is like this.
Over time, I guess to argue with Claire, maybe I would be short one if I were putting predictive chips, right?
Wait, what one was?
One is that it's a turning point, and after Trump, everything is different.
Wait, why would you short it?
Because number one, I think just as a general rule of like forecasting, people are too trend dependent and
Yeah.
they forget like reversion to the mean. Number two, there is this element where it feels like, and maybe this is my certain types of privilege talking, right? But it feels like it's a little bit isolated in the snow globe. If you're not an immigrant, if you're not someone relying on the Obamacare exchanges, right?
A farmer.
A farmer
It's a lot of people.
becomes a lot of people, someone in Puerto Rico.
Someone important, yeah.
But Obama had plenty of things too happen during his term, some
Yeah.
positive and which were negative, right? But there is a sense in which like it's almost so weird. It's like so much to process, and like there is like thesis and antithesis a lot in American politics. You know, the midterm campaign has seemed in some ways fairly normal.
Yeah, but let's assume.
I don't agree with
What
that.
do you
yeah,
mean?
I don't agree with that either. So let's say, Nate, that let's take last night with Andrew Gillum, who was the surprise winner in the Florida Democratic gubernatorial primary. If candidates like that, like I'm not sure what Gillum's actual chances are against DeSantis. They might actually be really good, but let's take races like that in Florida or races like Stacey Abrams versus Brian Kemp in Georgia, and like let's say that either of those candidates win, and like particularly I would say the more progressive candidates, and you start to have a new normal in a party be about populist politics, or not even populist, like kind of let's start over and question some of these capitalist norms that we have. Like let's actually be serious about campaign finance reform, and like let's whatever it might be. I don't see that going away. Like even if it doesn't happen in the midterms, even if those candidates don't win, I don't see that kind of politics going away.
I don't know if I do either, but number one, that's arguably fairly orthogonal to Trump. Number two, I think the number of insurgent candidates winning in the primaries has been not high by historical norms. Maybe even with the notable exception of Roy Moore, low on the GOP side. I mean, DeSantis, in his own way, is a kind of a not-so nominee in that race in
well,
Florida.
maybe it's an
promises
asymmetric
to-
change as far as parties go.
What does orthogonal mean?
Perpendicular.
No, I'm kidding. Here's a question. What if, because I agree that 2018 does not seem normal to me. The level of engagement and activism among women, among young people seems different to me. But here's a question. Let's say Trump loses in 2020 and is replaced by Kamala Harris, who then loses and is replaced by Tag Romney.
Wow.
Isn't it?
Wow, you've thought a lot.
Isn't it?
Deep into the Romney family tree there.
Hear me out. Isn't it possible, even in that world, that Trump could still be viewed as a turning point by those historians in 30 years? I guess what I'm trying to get at
Tag
is...
Romney looks like Mitt Romney. Given that, do you know how that works? That actually, if you're someone's son,
But you get what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
trying to get at there are different spheres where Trump can have an effect. One is on voters, on parties, which was Claire was getting at. But I also think there's there's a realm of what's permissible in politics. Maybe that's the only thing. Gillum is under FBI investigation.
Well, I think correct. I think Nate is
Tallahassee is under FBI.
Okay,
investigation.
yeah.
I think Nate is sort of. This is where I would say like his career biases show, where he is more apt to want to point to the symmetry and wisdom of numbers and trends rather than to recognize a single human point of change, which is, I think, that's a legitimate thing. I happen to disagree with it, but
that's covered in the outlier scenario, right? Because look, if the GOP loses, we can debate what it means if they lose one branch, right? But if they have a bad midterm, and then Trump is ousted either by the electorate or resigns or is removed from office, then everything Trump does is going to look like that didn't work. The system rebounded to punish Republicans and Donald Trump for that, and therefore there'll be strong desires to avoid repeating that behavior in the past.
But you're thinking like a GOP party elite. Their base.
Oh shit!
Their base was already on the Trump track, and their base is gonna until they
stay on that
they're
track.
going to stay on that track. So it's the Trump thing isn't a thing that'll go away when Trump leaves office.
Historically, nationalism has ebbed and flowed in countries. Maybe deep down there's the same underlying sentiments, but like the expression of it can change a lot over time. And if it were to end in humiliating failure for Republicans and for Donald Trump's voters, which it easily could, that's not a prediction, but like there are scenarios where, first of all, we're in an era of two-term presidents. Being a one-term president in some ways, not so small a humiliation, right? You know, and the scandal vector isn't getting better for Trump. I forgot to make that point earlier, by the way, which is I do feel like we have sustained pressure along that scandal dimension that we didn't before. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's like one of the, you know, there's like this.
No, I feel the same way though. But I still wouldn't go to consumed. I don't know. I think lengthening out the time horizon makes this a harder conversation because U.S. politics is so cyclical anyway.
Wait. It's cyclical in the sense of parties occupying the White House changing it or having power in Congress changing on very regular rhythms. So incumbents, an incumbent party might lose the House during a midterm year. But U.S. politics, I don't think they're not cyclical from a policy point of view, right? Don't we sort of evolve? Like my argument is about changing ideas in U.S. politics.
Yeah.
More than I don't think it's cyclical. I do think there is an arc.
There's an arc.
Or a line that's shooting out into the ocean, whatever it is.
So wouldn't you judge that, though, then like, okay, if in 10 years from now the U.S. has a much more restrictionist immigration policy than it does now, then I think you'd have to look back and say Trump either was or was representative of a turning point, right?
I think there is...
Same on trade.
At least as good a chance, let's just call it roughly as good a chance that the U.S. will be more open toward immigration.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of Trump in the long run.
But Claire, you think it's more likely that we're 10 years from now, relative to before Trump, we have more restrictions?
No. I didn't make any argument either way. I'm just saying Trump changes it no matter what. Like I think the original point of argument about this was that Nate was saying Trump is just kind of like a plot point in a trend that was already happening. And I'm saying he's a little bit more of like a big bang, like something about Trump and the Trump era shifts the trend even more. Like he is not just a part of a trend, he is a trend maker.
There's
or an era maker.
A common sense to that appeals to me. Just Trump is Trump is so off the charts on so many metrics that all else being equal, wouldn't you expect him to have a lasting?
Like you could also you could also make the argument that like FDR started a political era, not
of like the imperial presidency,
right? Like the Great Depression was maybe going to shift American politics no matter what, but FDR did power grabs that helped solidify liberal politics in a certain way for the mid-century, minus like, but you know,
yeah.
Okay, well, one of the more obvious analogies one could draw is to Nixon. And in which category would you place Nixon among those three?
FDR.
Between outlier,
inflection point,
and actually
along a trend.
Along the pre-existing trend.
Inflection point.
Yeah. Because he...
Carter.
Well, there was Carter, but
Carter was very not Nixon-like.
No, but
which was the point because people were disillusioned by politics. They wanted to choose the outsider from Washington. He was a failure, and then they snap back to then you get Reagan, and you get the Republican reign.
You get Reagan, you get George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush. Okay, if Nixon stood for law and order and a muscular foreign policy, then I think he did presage several decades where that was the de facto U.S. positioning, where even Democrats sort of...
But Nixonian is not an adjective that has a positive connotation.
Right, you're saying as a sort of failed presidency, was it an inflection point?
What do you think he was? Do you think he was an inflection point? Do you think he was part of a trend line?
I mean, I think Nixon was, I don't know. I think
How can you argue anything other than inflection point, Nate? Just fight the contrarian devil on your back.
Because several of the next several presidents were, I mean, Reagan had to run Contra, so maybe I shouldn't say that. And Clinton had a lot of, okay. But Jimmy Carter was pretty darn clean.
I don't know. He had unclean thoughts about other women.
What about
both the Bushes were fairly clean. Obama was very clean.
Well, George H.W. Bush might have known about Iran-Contra.
If you had a scandal variable in
Wait a second.
No, wait,
George
but why is
W.
this-
Bush wasn't clean. There were all types of scandals during that administration.
Torture.
Torture.
That's not a scandal.
Yes, it is.
It's a policy.
Oh, my God. Ugh.
Okay.
It's
Abu
scandal-
Ghraib?
Abu Ghraib. They
were proud of that.
U.S. attorney thing. Valerie Plame.
Wait, but also, how is
See,
this?
here's the thing that
how is this
gets
suddenly
me
a thing
into-
only about scandals? Why can't it be about Americans' mindset about politics and the increasing jadedness towards politics?
You know the program, The Newsroom, where it would fast forward? It was all set in 2011, which was a really boring year for politics, right? And it'd be like, oh my God, I remember when we had to write about that stupid thing that happened, right? And pretend it was important back in the New York Times. Anyway, but
We've gone way off the rails.
But the point being that things are going to happen. Some benchmark level of weirdness is normal. You're going to have a few more progressive candidates win in primaries and a few more Tea Party-ish candidates win in primaries, right? So you're not comparing relative to zero, but relative to some replacement level craziness. And politics is often a little bit crazy.
Let me ask one question, which is, I think, slightly related to this and also brings us back towards these paths, and then we can start to wrap. Mike, I want to pick up on something you said about Trump is, an outlier and is doing all of these sort of abnormal things. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about is U.S. politics sort of going on as usual. And I think we got a few emails along these lines, and I just, in looking back at these paths, it feels like there's potentially this emerging trend of sort of Trump world and then politics world, and those maybe being a little more separate than we're used to in our politics. But I don't know, does that feel like it's potentially something that's emerging right now, where Trump is going to do his thing and it's sort of both consuming but also sort of a sideshow?
I don't think so. I think it's possible to separate policy and norms and rhetoric and civility and all that to some extent. But I don't think you can separate. I think Trump is the sun,
is politics.
Yeah, around which all of politics orbits, and it's. Yeah, I don't think you can separate them. Even if they seem separate, the solar system analogy I just made up is actually pretty good. Where you might not see it, but there's a gravity pulling.
Also, I'll be a semantics asshole and say that
why should today be any different than?
We're talking about politics and not policy. Mm-hmm. Trump is politics. Politics is all about the rhetoric, the posturing. Policy might be relatively normal in some areas, but the politics of Congress is continually intertwined with the politics of what Trump tweets. And that, by the way, goes for Democrats on the Hill, Republicans on the Hill, Democrats running for city council and, bumfuck whatever, Republicans running for dog catcher. People run everything based on Trump's rhetoric, which is why I think it's crazy to argue that he is just a part of a trend, because he has infused American culture in such an interesting and complete way.
That's important. And also, this conversation has clarified for me, a key question seems to be how abnormal, and I don't mean that to have any negative connotations, but how abnormal is the reaction to Trump? In other words, how abnormal, we have seen women get into politics and do activism seemingly like we haven't seen in a while. How abnormal is that? Or are we going to look back in 3 years and be like, yeah, that was kind of like the Tea Party, but it was just, whatever, a different group
you could
of
argue
people.
that the Me Too movement caught steam because of Trump, and that's not an explicitly political thing. That's a cultural thing that has saturated America.
How abnormal is that? It seems like a big question, sort of how lasting is it, and what is the scale of it relative to things like the Tea Party or other movements? That's a big question. And then also, if Democrats do win the House, if it's a drubbing for Republicans in November, how does Trump react? I haven't been thinking about that, but that seems like such an important question.
And so, I mean, it's probably natural that we're thinking about this stuff now that we're 2 years into the Trump presidency. But it feels like if we were rewriting these paths now, there would maybe be a grouping of paths more about the reaction to Trump explicitly, progressive snapback.
Yeah.
He defines the GOP going forward, other movements. But it feels like that's a universe of paths that we can start to envision now that we have some more of this stuff along, kind of.
Nate, you should update
You should update this.
How many paths? What would the number of paths?
No Senate model?
Yeah, forget the Senate model.
Forget the Gov
Clearly
model.
go back to this one. Any final thoughts?
Maybe try and get down to 7.
That's what you go to, 7?
Maybe. 14's a lot.
That's progress.
14 was a lot. Yeah, you had a
7.
lot of energy on February 3rd, 2017. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Happy Labor Day to everyone around the table. Nate Silver.
Thank you.
Claire Malone.
Thanks.
Haven't we recorded like
Mike
13
Cohen.
podcasts today? It feels like
You have.
it feels like on Jeopardy where you have to record 5 episodes in a row. Not that I've ever been on Jeopardy.
You recorded 2 podcasts. It feels
Whoa,
like 13.
you should go on Jeopardy.
I know.
I don't actually. Would you be good at it?
My mom is
Yes.
amazing at Jeopardy. I'm much better than you.
It's
By
different
the
when
way,
you're on the couch.
did
man.
you guys
if you're
watch-
standing there and you
No,
need to
I
hit
know,
the
there's
buzzer, it's a
pressure.
whole thing.
I'd be good at Wheel of Fortune.
You know who knows
trivia.
political trivia? Did you guys see Stump Rick Klein on the ABC live stream?
Well,
last
yes,
night?
I did because I
Claire
was
was
on the
on it.
live stream.
I was amazed that he knew some
really
of those
good.
answers. Yeah,
He was really good.
he is knowledgeable about political history on a level of, dare I say,
Oh, no.
Micah Cohen. No, Harry Enton.
Yeah.
My name is Jody Avergan. Galen Druk is our producer. Tony Chow is in the control room. You can get in touch by emailing us podcast@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with any questions or comments about politics or really anything else. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a rating or review in the Apple Podcast Store. When you leave a rating, it helps our rankings, which helps others discover the show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back real soon.